And real quick about next week, because I've only had one group ask me this, but not everybody has to stand up here and present, so you guys can choose one or two people. It doesn't. I'm not grading like individually on presentation. I don't want one person to get stuck with the work, but you do only have that 10 minutes, and I won't cut you off. So if having one person be up here and do it makes things go faster instead of transitioning, that is okay. Okay, so nucleus accumbens. We were talking about structures that are now thought to be really important parts of the limbic system. The nucleus accumbens, which is part of the basal ganglia, is one of those structures. It's situated between the caudate and the putamen, and again, it is a nucleus, so around this area. And the most important function that's been associated with the nucleus accumbens is its participation in this reward circuit. And so we talked about earlier the importance of the orbital frontal cortex in identifying or placing value on sensory stimuli. The nucleus accumbens, anytime we experience something, particularly something that is considered rewarding or pleasurable, and that can be eating food, having sex, taking drugs, going for a run even, something healthy initially. An area of the brain called the ventral tegmentum, all right, so midbrain, you know the word tegmentum, but it's specifically the ventral tegmental area, and this part of the midbrain is stimulated and releases dopamine up to the nucleus accumbens. And in this case, dopamine is stimulating dopamine. The nucleus accumbens has D1 and D2 receptors, just like other parts of the striatum that we've looked at. And when the dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens are activated, it will increase the amount of dopamine produced by the nucleus accumbens. So that's going to send dopamine to other areas of the brain, including back to the prefrontal cortex and to other areas of the striatum. So if we think about this network in terms of reward, we can think about the ventral tegmentum providing that initial dopamine input to the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is also getting information from the amygdala, from the prefrontal cortex, and from the hippocampus. And so it's getting information about, hey, I like this. This makes me feel good. Or this has high reward value. This might be something I want to engage in. Or I have memories of doing this and feeling really good about it. So it's getting all of this input, and then its output, again, some output going back to the prefrontal cortex via the thalamus, but it's also then projecting its dopamine to the striatum. And dopamine going to the striatum is going to do what? Excite and probably increase movement, right? So we have this circuit of, hey, I like that. That looks good. Why don't I take it? Or do it? Or experience it? Or whatever it is. And so the nucleus accumbens is really important in this reward circuit, and again, unsurprisingly, strongly implicated in disorders of addiction, where this circuit becomes a little out of whack. And the main reason, particularly with drugs, that this circuit can become out of whack is that our brains, the nucleus accumbens in particular, is really not meant for huge dopamine spikes. And so this graph is just looking at release of dopamine from two stimuli, from a food stimulus, that pizza we were talking about earlier, and then taking in an amphetamine. So that pizza is raising dopamine, let's say the levels of about 150, it doesn't give us units here. Amphetamine is going to 1,000, so almost 10 times the amount of dopamine released. And our brains really were not meant to handle these huge spikes in dopamine. And this really can set off this addictive circuit where we become or go in search of things that give us this huge spike, which we don't get from normal everyday activities. Okay? So that's as much as I can do about addiction right now. But again, nucleus accumbens, really important for reward, pleasure, motivation, to a lesser extent, aversion of things that are unpleasant. And we learn through our experiences what we like, what we want to avoid. And again, the nucleus accumbens plays a key role in those things. The main player in the limbic system we've left for last, and that is the amygdala. And the amygdala receives highly processed sensory input from nearly all or all of the sensory systems. Less so vestibular, but I'm sure vestibular is still in there somewhere. And from a variety of other areas of the cortex, including the prefrontal cortex. Its output, it's going to have reciprocal connections with the sensory cortices, so it's getting input and providing output to the sensory cortices. And that's what you see in this image here, is reciprocal connections between the amygdala, again that almond-shaped structure, deep to the medial temporal cortex, projecting to and receiving input from the primary visual cortex. Right? The amygdala is going to have output not only to sensory cortices and other limbic structures, it's going to have major input to the hypothalamus. We'll see that one of its most important roles is to help regulate hypothalamic responses to emotion, or those physiological responses to emotion. And it's also going to project to the periaqueductal gray matter in the midbrain. If you remember midbrain, here's our cerebral aqueduct. The periaqueductal gray was the gray matter surrounding that. What do you associate with, or what have we talked about related to the periaqueductal gray before? Pain regulation. We don't even need to worry about neurotransmitters. Descending regulation of pain responses. That's as much as I want you to remember. Okay, so that's not really important. I just want you to know that, because that's the most important thing that this part does. All right, it's descending regulation of pain. It also, related to what we're talking about, is involved or can provide defensive responses. So, in situations where we may be fearful, defensive reactions may be things like freezing or running away, and then some of those sort of things that we typically associate with sympathetic or parasympathetic functions, like changes in heart rate or respiratory rate. So the hypothalamus is not the only regulator of those things. It is the prime regulator of those things, and certainly the amygdala has important connections there, but it also is projecting to the periaqueductal gray for these types of fear or defensive responses. So if we look at amygdala, the most important amygdala functions, this is kind of an overview slide. I'm going to break some of these down. Again, it has potent influences over the hypothalamus, and we'll talk more about the hypothalamus next week, so I'm not going to get into these details. The amygdala also has a role in modulating aggression. We did see, again, that the hypothalamus had some role in aggressive behaviors as well, but some of that is regulated by the amygdala. It is the prime driver of fear responses. That is a major role of the amygdala, and it also plays a role in memory. And those are the three things that we'll talk about in this lecture. A lot of what we know about amygdala function is due to researchers Kluver and Bucy. I think, again, where's my German person? Lars, is that how you say it? Huh? Kluver. Yes?
Could be Kluver, but I think it's Kluver.
Okay. These guys at the University of Chicago in the 1930s, they're studying the effects of mescaline on monkeys. It doesn't really matter, but basically they ended up taking out both temporal lobes in a bunch of rhesus monkeys. And what they found were a constellation of behaviors that are now known as Kluver-Bucy syndrome. That's worse than saying neurological terms. And what they saw is that these animals had normal visual acuity, visual perception, but they had visual agnosia, meaning they couldn't recognize objects based on vision. Why? Think about temporal lobe. Why is object recognition hard? Damage to that ventral stream coming from the primary visual cortex going up to the frontal lobes. That runs through the temporal lobe. So that's gone. So they can't recognize things based on vision. So what do? Well, they put everything in their mouth. So to identify something, or when they're exploring something, everything is going in their mouth. So they did these experiments where they mixed non-food objects in with their food, and they basically had to mouth everything before they would decide whether to eat it. So they saw what they called hyperorality, again, putting things in their mouth. These monkeys that had this bilateral removal of their temporal lobes were hypersexual, heightened interest in sex and sexual behaviors. And the most prominent symptom was, or result of this condition, was an absence of fear. And so they did these trials where they would have strange humans, not their normal caretakers, come into the cage with the animal. And a normal monkey behavior is if a strange animal enters your territory, you're going to either cower in a corner or you're going to, pose in like an aggressive stance or an aggressive behavior. These monkeys were like, hey, what's up? You want to hold me? Great. You want to pet my hair? I mean, like complete absence of fear to these strangers. So not only an absence of fear, but decreased aggressive response as well. And they did some other experiments where they would put like a snake, which is a normal, like, monkeys don't like snakes are bad. And it was the same thing. They'd go up to the snake and be like, hey, what's up? They might get bit. And they'd be like, hey, what's up? Like, so they wouldn't necessarily learn from their mistakes either or show fear even when they had been attacked. So, and some flattened affect that went along with that as well. But again, the main thing was this complete absence of fear. And the important thing here is that by removing the temporal lobe, you are losing both amygdala. In humans, it's a very rare situation where somebody would lose both their temporal lobes or even both of their amygdala. This can happen in herpes simplex encephalitis, which is actually the most common cause of bilateral amygdala lesions. And possibly you could have this with tumors as well. Another situation where you may see this is if somebody has severe epilepsy in both temporal lobes and those are removed. But again, this would be a very rare situation that you would see this in humans. But when it does happen, the characteristics are not dissimilar to what we saw in monkeys. It shares visual agnosia as a symptom, so again, not being able to recognize objects, loss of normal fear and anger responses, also typically some memory loss, and this could be because the amygdala's role in formation of memories, which we'll talk about in a minute. Also because if you're taking out parts of the temporal lobe, you're also probably damaging the hippocampus to some degree. So memory loss for either of those reasons. And some cognitive issues like distractibility and impulsivity. The hypersexuality is sometimes there, but usually not as pronounced as what we saw or what they saw in the rhesus monkeys. So again, Hoover-Bussy syndrome, one to know about, but probably not one that you'll see very often. Another very rare disease is called Urbach-Wild disease, and this is a disease that causes general thickening of the skin and mucous membranes. It's a genetic disorder. It's super rare. Since like the 1930s when it was discovered, there have only been about 400 cases. So again, probably not one that you're going to see out on fieldwork or ever. But this hardening or this calcification can affect blood vessels as well. And for whatever reason, it targets the ventromedial temporal lobes, or the area of the human amygdala. And one of the most well-documented cases of this disorder is with a patient called SM. And they followed her, I don't know how long. I know that at least a 10-year follow-up was done. But after destruction of bilateral amygdala regions, they found that SM could neither recognize nor describe fear as manifested by facial expression. So like those pictures that we looked at earlier where you're like joy and sadness and whatever, she could do all of those. She could identify, and this would be this is brain damage controlled, but people who are brain damaged who don't have amygdala lesions, they can identify all of the emotions. For SM, she could identify happy, she could identify surprise, she could identify disgusted, could not identify fear or afraid in pictures of faces. Also, they would design experiments, and I don't know exactly what they did with her. I hope they didn't put her in a cage with a snake. But in situations that were designed to evoke fear, she did not demonstrate a normal fear response. And as a general principle, in her interactions with people, she was overly trusting and tended not to have good personal space boundaries or issues, which we talked about more is related to prefrontal cortex. But again, amygdala and prefrontal cortex talk back and forth a lot. So being able to interpret the emotion to respond appropriately to the situation. So again, rare disorder. I want you to be familiar with it, but chances of you seeing it clinically are probably unlikely. So amygdala plays a role in fear. It also modulates aggression. And we mainly talked about what happens when you destroy the amygdala. But what happens if you stimulate the amygdala? Well, if you enhance functions of the amygdala, you're likely to see increased vigilance, so paying more attention to what's going on in your environment, heightened attention. All of this heightened attention and vigilance can lead to heightened levels of anxiety, fear, heightened fear responses, and in animals more so than humans, heightened levels of aggressiveness. So again, this tells us what the primary roles of the amygdala are. In this case, what happens if we have overactivity in the amygdala versus damage or underactivity in the amygdala. And it's unsurprising that the amygdala is linked to disorders like anxiety, which we're going to talk about more next week, because you kind of need to know autonomic to understand anxiety. But it also plays a role in things like PTSD. All right, last piece with the amygdala is that we know when an event is emotional for us, or we attach some level of emotional significance to it, that we're more likely to remember it. So you're probably more likely to remember what you ate, I don't know, at your best friend's wedding than you did what you ate for lunch last Thursday. So we attach emotional significance to things, and this is mainly through, again, the role of the amygdala. And one of the classic experiments, I think your book talks about this one, or your chapter talks about this as well, is the concept of associated learning, that we can learn to be fearful of things that really we shouldn't be fearful of. And we do this through a process of conditioning. So in this case, a electrical shock is paired with a benign tone, like a beep. So if I go beep, most of you guys don't get upset or scared. But if I, pressed a button in your seats, I'll give you an electrical shock, that probably would elicit some type of emotion in you, anger or fear. That gets processed, that tone is getting processed through the auditory cortex, but that emotional response is getting processed here in the amygdala. All right, that's what this green blob is, and you don't need to know the different parts of the amygdala, bless you. But the amygdala is pairing that shock with that tone. They're happening at the same time. So your brain is not necessarily distinguishing that fear response as being due to the shock as opposed to being due to the tone. And over time, animals that are exposed to these stimuli paired together become fearful of the tone itself, even in the absence of an electrical shock. So they just hear the beep, but of course the beep has always been associated with the shock, so they begin to have a fear response due to the tone itself. And that fear response can be autonomic responses via the hypothalamus, their heart races, their rat paws, sweat, heightened respiratory rate. They can have these defensive reactions, behavioral reactions via the periaqueductal gray matter, and experience. I hear a tone and I am fearful. All right, so all of those aspects of emotion can be elicited through this conditioned or through this learned response. And the key driver in that learning is the amygdala. So before we go on to disorders, I wanted to come back to the hippocampus really quick, because I said earlier, when we kind of said Papez circuit, not that important for emotion, hippocampus, not that important for emotion, the hippocampus is still tied to the limbic system in an intimate and important way. We know the key roles of the hippocampus are in making new memories or learning new things. But this also includes that emotional learning that we just talked about, that we attach emotional significance to things, which is going to make us more able to store those memories, form those memories, and eventually store those memories for long-term access. The hippocampus does play some role in aggressive behavior, and we're not going to really get into that, but it does have or attach emotional significance in relation to aggression or anger. via the hypothalamus, the hippocampus is going to play some role in endocrine functions. Again, mainly I remember something happening. You know, if you remember a bad event, you can still have some of those same physiological responses that you would have if you were experiencing the event. And it's linked to stress systems as well, so that prolonged stress can actually decrease cells or kill cells in the hippocampus. So that's why in some disorders where people experience long-term chronic stress, they have problems with learning and memory. It's due to that connection between the stress systems, primarily endocrine stress systems, the HPA axis, which we'll talk about next week, and the hippocampus. And we have to remember the hippocampus because it is involved in a lot of different types of mental illness, such as PTSD, schizophrenia, and depression. And it's also one of the primary structures that's targeted in Alzheimer's disease. So we're going to talk a little bit about schizophrenia and PTSD now, and we'll probably try and hit depression a little bit next week. Again, you need to understand the stress systems before you can really understand anxiety and depression. And we've talked about Alzheimer's disease before. So I wanted to make sure we went back to the hippocampus before we started talking about all of those disorders again. So, again, we're going to do 3 disorders. We're going to do schizophrenia, PTSD, and OCD. Hopefully I can get through them all. I know from med lectures, you guys have probably already heard or learned about schizophrenia. These are the main things it is characterized by. You probably think of it mainly as related to psychosis, disturbances in speech, disturbances in appearance or behavior. Those are the primary symptoms. But also there are emotional aspects to schizophrenia, including things like apathy or a paucity of emotions, a flattened affect, things like atypical posturing or atypical movements or catatonic postures, and some verbal memory impairments as well. And the verbal memory impairments can be one of the first signs of schizophrenia. So I want to focus mainly on these emotional aspects of schizophrenia. And we look at what's going on in the brains of people that have schizophrenia. We see damage to structures like the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus, the prefrontal cortex, and the basal ganglia. All of which, or almost all of which, we've talked about as limbic structures. So particularly the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, and the prefrontal cortex. But we just said the hippocampus plays a role in things like aggressive behaviors and memories of emotions. And the reason, or the way they've been able to find what structures are involved in schizophrenia, a lot of it has been twin studies. So you take a twin that has developed schizophrenia and a twin that has not developed schizophrenia. And if you look at the brain of the schizophrenic twin, they have a larger lateral ventricle. And so that expansion of the lateral ventricle somehow destroys the structures surrounding it, which tend to be these areas, the subcortical areas around the temporal lobe. And these limbic structures and basal ganglia, the damage to these areas maps onto what we were seeing here. So damage to limbic structures is going to lead to things like apathy or paucity of emotion, an inability to generate an appropriate emotional response, whereas damage to the basal ganglia can be related to the atypical movements or atypical posturing that we see in this disorder as well. So damage to these areas doesn't necessarily cover the full spectrum of what we see in schizophrenia, but it relates to certain aspects of the disorder. And one of the, did anybody do their neuro paper on schizophrenia or the dopamine hypothesis? I think that was one of the options. No. Anyway, one of the hypotheses is that dopamine is due to excessive dopamine activity, excessive dopaminergic activity. And that's because of the fact that, one, dopamine is a major player in parts of some of the structures that are implicated in schizophrenia, like the basal ganglia, like the prefrontal cortex. Also, if you give somebody with schizophrenia dopamine blockers so that it's reducing the amount of dopamine, it can reduce some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. So again, you don't need to know the biology of that, but dopamine imbalance or excessive dopamine is thought to be one of the contributing factors to schizophrenia. PTSD, again, I feel like you guys have had in med lectures, maybe some of your adult class as well. Just a quick history on PTSD. It has been around since the 1980s, so not really that long. And pretty much every edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or the DSM, has defined PTSD differently. So it's kind of evolved in what it is over these number of editions, over these number of years. It used to be classified as an anxiety disorder, as a type or a subtype of anxiety disorder. It is no longer classified as such. It is in a new chapter called Trauma and Stress or Related Disorders. And in this new definition, it says that PTSD can be caused by exposure to actual or threatened death. So the perception of trauma can be as debilitating as actual exposure to it, serious injury or sexual violation. So exposure or threat of. And then the disturbance, or what you see, is clinically significant distress, impairment in social interaction, work capacity, or work function. So it can affect a variety of areas. There is a subtype for kids under age 6, and we don't need to know what the details of that are. But in addition to functional limitations, individuals with PTSD typically display things like anxiety, depression, problems with arousal, hyper-arousal, usually more so than hypo-arousal, and difficulties with cognitive functioning like impairments in attention or concentration or distractibility, and potentially reduced responsiveness. So again, we're not here to do med lectures, but just again as an overview of what it is, and what are some of the possible causes. A lot of times when we think about PTSD, we think about veterans, soldiers coming back with combat injuries. We also see it in people who have experienced sexual or physical assault, have been hostage or imprisoned, have been exposed to terrorism, natural or man-made disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, any type of accident, or some type of trauma where they have received devastating news about a life-threatening illness. Those are the possible events. All right, so what's going on in the brain of people with PTSD? Well, these are MRI, probably really poorly, show poorly on your slides. But when you put somebody, and these were done with combat veterans, you put them in an MRI machine, probably an fMRI machine, and expose them to a sound similar to what they would hear in combat. I assume these are explosions or gunshots or something along those lines. You get hyperactivation in the amygdala region. So that's what these red arrows are pointing to. And that's in comparison to healthy individuals and vets without PTSD. So one of the signs of PTSD, maybe not necessarily the cause, but one of the key brain changes is that you get exaggerated amygdala activation. And this is thought to be due to not necessarily a fault in the amygdala itself, but a problem with that descending inhibition. Remember we talked about the prefrontal cortex is really important for having that modulatory control over the amygdala. We talked about how that's important or related to the teen brain. And when the prefrontal cortex isn't fully online, it can exert that descending control over the amygdala, and we get hyper-emotionality or hyper-activation of the amygdala. Same thing happening here in PTSD. Whatever has happened has affected the ability of the prefrontal cortex to exert that modulatory influence on the amygdala, and we get heightened amygdala activation. We also see this in kids with sensory hyperresponsivity, where there seems to be overactivation of the amygdala. So you don't need to know that, but that was, that's something that's coming out in the literature. Another thing that we see in PTSD is that degeneration of the hippocampus. That chronic, prolonged stress affects the ability to learn, to concentrate, to make new memories. And again, this isn't the cause of PTSD, but it's a cause of some of those cognitive symptoms that go along with it. slide just to save time. The last disorder that we're going to talk about today is OCD. Again, just a refresher, hopefully from a previous class, that obsessions are recurring sensations, thoughts, feelings, or ideas that tend to elevate anxiety levels. We typically think of obsessions as thoughts, but they can be feelings as well. And they tend to increase anxiety levels. Compulsions are actions or behaviors that are done usually to reduce anxiety. And this is what we think of typically with PTSD, of somebody OCD that has compulsive hand washing or cleaning behaviors. They do this because it makes them feel better. It reduces the anxiety. So obsessions and compulsions tend to go hand in hand in this disorder. And the important thing is why it's a disorder is that these are, if you clean your house, you don't have OCD. But that the frequency, the intensity, or the duration of these behaviors or ideas is disproportionate to reality and it interferes with normal function. So I mentioned earlier that OCD was related to behaviors or related to areas of the prefrontal cortex. And in this case, it's specifically the orbitofrontal cortex, more so than the medial or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, even though those have been implicated as well. There's also differences in functioning of the caudate nucleus, which probably drives some of the actions or the movements or behaviors that we see. Differences in the cingulate cortex and the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus, which we said was really important for limbic functioning. And I thought it was interesting, I'm going to read off my notes for this, but when they were talking about the orbitofrontal cortex, one of the research studies said that the people who have OCD may be predisposed to rely excessively on habitual rather than on goal-directed behavior strategies. So remember, we did talk about the prefrontal cortex as being really important for goal-directed activities, making decisions, making choices about what to do. Well, if you have underactivity, which is what we see here, diminished activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, you're going to have diminished decision-making capabilities, diminished ability to make judgments about, given this situation, what should I do? So this research is saying that because there is diminished activity in this prefrontal cortex, or specifically the orbitofrontal cortex region, that they're relying on these habits or rituals or routines to get the job done, to get through their day. So I thought that was a really interesting way that this research is going. In these areas of the brain, particularly the orbitofrontal cortex, there seems to be diminished serotonin. And serotonin and dopamine are both monoamine drugs. They're in the monoamine family. They do slightly different things, but serotonin and dopamine are both in this prefrontal cortex. So diminished serotonin is reducing the activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, and therefore OCD can be treated or at least managed somewhat with SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that keeps more serotonin around longer. So there's more serotonin available for these parts of particularly the prefrontal cortex to use. So this is a long, extending lecture. To summarize, when we talk about emotions are both felt, so that's subjective experience of emotions, and they are also experienced or expressed via physiological changes in somatic motor responses. Our heart rate goes up, our palms sweat, we gesture, we smile, we do whatever. So both of those aspects of emotion are important to remember. We talked about that each side of the brain processes emotions differently. The left side is associated with what? Positive or negative? Positive emotions. Right side, more negative emotions, plus a lot of other things like understanding emotion in speech, understanding emotional facial expression, all of those things. We talked about key limbic structures. We talked about the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, which is mainly a relay station. We didn't talk about it in and of itself. and the nucleus accumbens. And closely associated structures are the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the cingulate gyrus. So as you're studying, I would go through and make sure you can identify the major functions of the limbic system as a whole, and then what's unique about those main areas that we talked about, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the hippocampus. We will talk more about the hypothalamus next week because it does a lot more than what we talked about today. As you look at these structures individually, what are the major inputs and outputs? A lot of them project to the hypothalamus, so what's unique about some of the others? And as you go through, think about what disorders are involved with impairments in the limbic system. Mainly today we talked about schizophrenia, OCD, and PTSD, but we also talked about amygdala disorders like the Guillain-Barré syndrome, or Urbach-Wise disease. We talked about dysfunction in Papez's circuit, what would that look like? So throughout we've sprinkled in some other disorders that you need to know about as well. And I think that's it for today. I could have added more in, darn it. I'll know for next year. Since we have time, are there questions? Yeah.
Skipped over a PTSD slide. I guess for treatment options. Anything you want to, make sure we know?
I think all this slide said was what can influence whether somebody develops PTSD or not. And so I think it's sort of like the more prepared they are for what they're going to experience, the less likely they are to develop PTSD. I'm trying to find the slide. If their fight or flight responses are successful, if they have prior experience, their support, things like that. Interestingly, I'm not going to talk about this slide, but one of the things we talked about, like with chronic stress, if you can have decreased or diminished hippocampal activity or destruction in the hippocampus. One of the things they're finding is because they're doing brain scans of soldiers before they go out to combat and then afterwards. And having a larger hippocampus can actually be a protective factor against developing PTSD. So if ahead of time you have a larger hippocampus, you may be less likely to develop PTSD, even if you are exposed to the same type of combat trauma. Bonus question on the quiz. One person got right. Kind of. They were the closest. I gave them the full point. So I did send out to all of you an explanation of that case, why it was the answer that it was. So I would encourage you to look at that. If you still have questions, I'll leave time to answer that next week, okay? All right. See you later. Yes.
When we do our horizontal segments, you don't want us to do brains.
No, you don't have horizontal.
We have the
You do there, and I've been going for like a really long time. Still,